Product provided for review. Thanks, WayForward. Developed by WayForward and published by Arc System Works and Limited Run Games, River City Girls Zero is an updated re-release of the previously Japan-exclusive Super Famicom game Shin Nekketsu Koha Kunio-tachi no Banka. Just to be clear, however, despite the extra bells and whistles, the game itself is emulated and thus virtually unchanged. Oh, before I go any further, I feel I should mention that I played this game solo. As that's generally not considered optimal conditions for playing a beat 'em up, feel free to account for that when weighing my opinions against those of other reviewers. Let's start with what's new. The game features a new opening animation with an original song, 2 new manga-style cutscenes, a gallery, multiple translations, and the ability to save mid-game, something the original 16-bit version of the game lacked. The gallery is fairly minimal, only featuring the game's box art, original manual, which remains untranslated, and cartridge label. While it's a small thing, I especially appreciate the additional inclusion of 3D models of the original Super Famicom cartridge and game box. The game also features multiple translations, including 2 English localizations. The new localization mostly differs in that it contains extra jokes and a few fourth wall breaks that make it tonally more in line with River City Girls. The literal translation, on the other hand, more accurately reflects the game's original script and feels much more like what we would have gotten if this game was translated in the 90s, right down to the grammatical errors and stilted phrasing. Personally, I thought the updated localization was more engaging and gave the characters more distinct personalities. The game begins with Kunio and Riki being locked up for a hit and run they didn't commit. They learn from a visiting classmate that someone who looks identical to Kunio has been spotted around town. Realizing they've been framed, Kunio and Riki break out of jail to clear their names. Oh, and Misako and Kyoko join them at some point. It's a pretty standard story, and it plays out in the usual fashion. Go to place, fight thugs, learn who thugs work for, repeat. That's not to say it's bad. WayForward's dialogue keeps the plot engaging via entertaining character interactions. Additionally, the dialogue serves to provide motivation and context for the protagonist's actions, keeping the story coherent and interesting. There is a lot of talking compared to your average beat 'em up, however, to the point where it almost feels like it's half visual novel. Story is definitely an emphasis in this title. River City Girls Zero is a belt-scrolling beat-em-up, not unlike other games in the River City series. Unlike River City Ransom or River City Girls, however, it features no RPG components. There's no experience points, money, or character growth. Moreover, the game is completely linear. Unlike the aforementioned River City games, River City Girls Zero doesn't feature an open-ended city explorer. The game does add some variety in the form of motorcycle stages and even the occasional side-scrolling platforming segment. The game's controls take some getting used to. Firstly, kicking is mapped to the A button, punching to the Y button, and jumping to the B button. Placing the jump button between the punch and the kick button is really unintuitive and tripped me up several times. Moreover, the controls can be unresponsive, with the game not registering certain inputs. This is most notable when trying to enter the commands for special attacks quickly. As best as I can tell, the game just doesn't accept input during some animation frames, such as the first few frames of a character's jumping animation. Lastly, the collision for attacks can be a little bit fiddly. Attacks have next to no reach on the Z-axis, and even on the X-axis, it's easy to overshoot and end up attacking behind one's opponent. River City Girls Zero's biggest problem isn't its controls, however. It's that the game is infuriatingly difficult in some of the worst ways. This game gets incredibly cheap about halfway through. Enemies, and especially bosses, often have near instantaneous recovery from getting hit, meaning they can immediately retaliate and stunlock players with a full combo in the time it would take the player character to throw a second punch. Because of this, most bosses in the latter half of the game can only be defeated by abusing special techniques. If you like jump kicks, you're going to be doing a lot of jump kicks. At least when the game registers the input for jump kicks. This is made worse by the fact that the final act is only available on normal difficulty. Well, at least the game gives players infinite continues. Now, I've been complaining a lot, but I don't want to give the impression that this game is completely awful. River City Girls is quite a fun brawler when it behaves itself. Players have a wide variety of both normal and special attacks at their disposal, and walloping delinquents, bikers, and yakuza with said techniques is fun for the majority of the game. It's just a shame that it's peppered with cheaply implemented difficulty spikes that can only be passed by using repetitive cheese tactics instead of making full use of the options available to the player. The game's visuals also suffer from some curious quirks. For instance, the game's display doesn't use the entirety of the screen, leaving a blank portion at the bottom. This isn't a weird emulation thing either, it's present in every screenshot I could find. Another minor complaint is that most stages aren't very interesting to look at. Most are just empty hallways or streets with little in the way of eye-catching scenery or interactive set pieces. Other than those quibbles, the graphics are fine. While I don't think anyone will be amazed at what they see, the game is well animated by the standards of its time. Some enemies even have extra animations that exist solely to give them a little extra personality, such as fixing their hair after an attack. I also have to give the original developers props for going to the trouble to animate the plaid on Misako and Kyoko's skirts, something the animators for the new intro cinematic didn't even attempt. As for the game's music, it's good. In fact, I would say it does a pretty good job of representing the Super Nintendo style, if such a thing exists. Fans of the 16-bit era will definitely appreciate this game's soundtrack. Before I give my final thoughts, I'd like to point out something. This game isn't about Misako and Kyoko. Throughout the game, the eponymous River City girls are just tagging along. I don't blame WayForward for branding the game the way they did, as the game River City Girls was well received and this is the character's first appearance. Just understand that this originally was, and still is, ultimately a Kunio game. In the end, I have very mixed feelings about River City Girls 0. I like its tone, characters, music, and a fair amount of its gameplay. On the other hand, the game is riddled with questionable design decisions. Moreover, due to the latter half of the game's blatantly unbalanced boss battles, many fights are reduced to boring, repetitive slogs where the player does nothing other than jump kick and then stomp his opponents. My rating for River City Girls 0 is a shrug. The game is available digitally for $15, which I don't think is unreasonable for the amount of content players will get. And before you ask, no, we never do find out who was impersonating Riki. It never comes up.